Sarah Winters had always seen her suburban home as more than just a place to rest her head. Nestled on a quiet street, surrounded by blooming gardens and the sounds of chirping birds, it was her sanctuary. After years of working as a renowned botanist, traveling the world to study rare plants, she finally settled into the perfect home to showcase her green thumb. The backyard, with its meticulously planned flower beds and exotic plant species, was her pride and joy. Her roses, particularly, had become the talk of the neighborhood, admired by everyone who passed by. Sarah's love for plants wasn't just a hobby, it was her life's work. Her research had earned her accolades in the botanical community, and her knowledge was sought after by universities and institutions around the world. She had even published several books on rare flora, her name respected among experts. But little did Sarah know, her peaceful life was about to be upended by someone who saw her efforts as a violation of the rules. Enter Karen Simmons, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood and the president of the local homeowners association, HOA. Karen's mission in life was simple: make sure everyone followed her interpretation of the community's rules, no exceptions. And when Sarah's roses began to climb the ranks of unapproved plant species, Karen took notice. It started with a letter, a polite, formal request to remove excessive foliage from the front yard. Karen claimed the roses, some of which had been planted long before Sarah even moved in, were violating HOA regulations on property appearance. Sarah, bewildered, tried to brush it off as an overzealous move from an overzealous woman. But when she received a second letter, this one threatening fines, it became clear that Karen wasn't backing down. "I've spoken to the board," Karen's message read. "The roses need to go, or you'll face a fine of $500 for every month they remain." Sarah couldn't believe what she was reading. A fine for planting roses? That seemed absurd. She'd been careful to respect every HOA rule she knew about, but this was something entirely new. With a mix of frustration and disbelief, Sarah stood on her porch, staring at the letter in her hands. How had it come to this? Determined to fight back, Sarah went to the HOA's next meeting, ready to speak her mind. As she entered the room, she found Karen sitting at the head of the table, smugly reviewing her clipboard. The moment Sarah spoke up, Karen interrupted her with a cold, "We've already made our decision." "You can't fine me for roses," Sarah said, her voice steady but with an underlying hint of anger. "I've done nothing wrong." Karen looked over the top of her glasses and smiled. "Well, technically you have. The rules are clear, and we expect everyone to follow them." But Sarah wasn't backing down. She'd spent years fighting for things she believed in. This HOA, this woman, wouldn't be the exception. The fight was just beginning, and she would. HOA's first power move. Sarah thought the first confrontation with Karen would be the hardest, but she quickly realized that Karen wasn't about to let up. The next morning, a $750 fine appeared taped to Sarah's front door. The violation? Unauthorized plantings. A vague but pointed accusation that seemed to target Sarah's prized roses. She was shocked but not deterred. Her first instinct was to call the local authorities, but she knew better. Karen had made it clear in her letter that the HOA's rules were irrevocable, and she had enough power to make those rules stick. Sarah's frustration grew as she stared at the fine, knowing that the money wouldn't make a dent in her income. But it wasn't about the money, it was the principle. Her neighbor, Jessica, stopped by later that day, shaking her head. "I heard about your fine," she said, her voice tinged with sympathy. "It's ridiculous. We've all seen your roses, Sarah. They're beautiful. I don't get it." "I've done nothing wrong," Sarah replied, her frustration palpable. "I've lived here for years, and no one ever said anything about my plants." Jessica looked around nervously, as if making sure no one else was listening. "Karen has a personal vendetta against anyone who dares to step outside the lines of her perfect neighborhood. I don't know if you've noticed, but she's been on a rampage lately, fining people for the most ridiculous things." Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed with an alert. Another HOA letter had arrived. This time, the language was even more threatening. If she didn't remove the roses by the end of the week, the fine would increase to $1,000, and the HOA would escalate further actions, involving city inspectors. It was as if Karen was trying to use her position to bully Sarah into submission. Sarah's resolve hardened. She wasn't just going to roll over and let Karen win this one. She picked up her phone and made a call to a local lawyer she trusted. "I'm being fined for something as ridiculous as my roses," Sarah said when the lawyer picked up. "Can they really do this?" The lawyer laughed lightly, though Sarah could hear the seriousness in his tone. No, they can't. But you're going to have to show them you're not afraid to fight back. Let me look into it and get back to you. For the rest of the day, Sarah went about her usual routine. But now, every time she passed her roses, they seemed like a symbol of defiance. The HOA could threaten all they wanted, but they wouldn't take her plants away. Then, late in the afternoon, Sarah caught sight of Karen standing across the street, clipboard in hand, watching her every move. Sarah knew she had to act fast. She wasn't just going to wait for the HOA to push her around. She had the right to fight back. The next day, Sarah began drafting a response. She'd heard whispers that Karen had gone too far with her tactics, and it was time to put that to the test. She was going to make Karen regret ever underestimating her. The HOA escalates the conflict. The HOA's response to Sarah's legal consultation came quicker than she anticipated. Early one morning, she found a letter from Karen, this time warning her that the HOA was considering escalating the matter if she continued to refuse to remove her roses. The language in the letter was even more aggressive than before, hinting at legal action, property seizure, and even possible eviction if she didn't comply with their demands. Sarah's blood boiled. Eviction? Over roses? She muttered to herself, disbelief creeping into her thoughts. She knew this was about control, not plants. That afternoon, Sarah sat in her living room, reviewing the documents she had gathered, bylaws, local property ordinances, and records of every fine she had received. It wasn't just about roses anymore. The HOA was flexing its muscle, attempting to crush any resistance with intimidation. Karen and the board were no longer enforcing rules. They were abusing their power. "I'm not going down like this," Sarah whispered, her jaw clenched with determination. She was already putting together a strategy to fight back, and this time, she wasn't alone. Her lawyer had found a legal loophole, something Karen and the board had failed to notice. It turned out that the HOA's rules regarding exterior modifications were vague, and Sarah's flowers, technically, didn't violate any of them. Still, Karen had a knack for turning small issues into big problems, and she wasn't about to let this go. Over the next few days, Sarah quietly started to gather evidence. She spoke with neighbors, asking if they had ever faced similar issues with the HOA. As it turned out, she wasn't the only one who had been unfairly targeted. One neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, revealed that Karen had once fined him for excessive lawn decorations, a few holiday lights that had been up for less than a week. It was becoming clearer. Karen's obsession with control was not only about the rules, it was about making money. Sarah dug deeper and learned that Karen had been in charge of the HOA for years, using her position to bully residents and make financial deals that benefited her and her cronies. The HOA's enforcement seemed arbitrary, often targeting people who didn't comply with Karen's personal vision of how the neighborhood should look. "I knew it," Sarah muttered as she reviewed some old HOA financial statements. She's been using this whole thing for personal gain. One evening, Sarah ran into her neighbor, Jessica, again. Jessica was holding her phone, a concerned look on her face. "I overheard something at the store today. Karen's been making side deals with contractors, getting kickbacks for the approved services the HOA uses. It's all about money." That was all Sarah needed to hear. She now had the smoking gun. Karen wasn't just abusing her power, she was committing fraud. The next morning, Sarah filed a formal complaint against Karen, citing the evidence she had gathered. Her lawyer was on board, and they were ready to take legal action. She couldn't let Karen's corruption continue unchecked. When Karen found out, she wasn't pleased. In fact, she seemed to take it as a personal affront. The HOA's retaliation came quickly, with another letter threatening immediate inspection of Sarah's property. But this time, Sarah didn't flinch. She knew she had the upper hand. As Sarah awaited the results of her legal battle, she could feel the tension in the neighborhood. Her roses had become a symbol of defiance, but they had also brought the community's frustrations with Karen's leadership to the surface. People were starting to speak out. Neighbors who had been afraid to challenge the HOA were now questioning Karen's decisions. The war was no longer just about roses. It was about standing up to abuse of power, about exposing corruption, and about reclaiming control of the neighborhood. And Sarah was ready for whatever came next. The HOA oversteps and the protagonist strikes back. Karen's retaliation took a sinister turn one morning when Sarah stepped outside to find a crew of workers digging up her driveway. A large excavator sat near her rose garden, and the workers, oblivious to her presence, went about their task as if it was just another day on the job. "What the hell is going on?" Sarah demanded, marching toward the crew leader. The worker, a middle-aged man in a hard hat, barely glanced up. "We've got orders to dig up this driveway." "Orders?" Sarah repeated, her eyes narrowing. "Who gave you those orders?" "The HOA," the worker said, gesturing toward the street. Sure enough, Karen was standing on the curb, clipboard in hand, watching the chaos unfold. Sarah's blood ran cold. It was clear that Karen had escalated the situation even further, and Sarah wasn't going to stand idly by while Karen tore up her property. "Karen!" Sarah called out, marching over to the HOA president. "What the hell is going on? Why are you digging up my driveway?" Karen smiled smugly, as if this was all part of the plan. "Your modifications to the front yard," she paused dramatically. "They've triggered this. We're just reassessing the situation. This is nothing but petty revenge." Sarah snapped. "You don't get to destroy my property just because I won't bow to your ridiculous demands." Karen didn't flinch. "Well, as you can see, we're just following protocol. It's for the greater good of the neighborhood." "Bullshit," Sarah growled. "You're abusing your position for personal gain, and I won't let you get away with it." As Sarah stood her ground, a few neighbors began to gather around, watching the confrontation. It was clear that they weren't happy with Karen's actions either. Sarah could feel their support building as she stood her ground, refusing to back down. "I'm calling the police," Sarah said, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. Karen's smug expression faltered for a moment, but quickly returned. "Go ahead. The HOA has the legal right to inspect." Before she could finish, Sarah's phone rang. It was her lawyer. "Sarah, I've got news. We've found something big. You've got a solid case for fraud. This whole thing is about to backfire on Karen." The news gave Sarah the boost she needed. She hung up, turned to the crew, and said, "Stop right now. If you don't, I'll have the authorities here in minutes." The workers hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. They didn't want to get caught up in a legal mess. "We'll need to check with the HOA," one of them said. "Go ahead," Sarah said, her voice firm. "You tell them that any further action will be considered trespassing, and I'll have every legal right to press charges." Reluctantly, the workers began to pack up, their tools clattering into the back of their truck. Karen watched with growing frustration as Sarah stood tall, not backing down. "You think this is over?" Karen sneered, her voice low and venomous. "You'll regret this." Sarah shook her head, a triumphant smile forming on her lips. "You're the one who's going to regret it, Karen." As the workers left, Sarah turned to face her neighbors, who were starting to murmur among themselves. For the first time in a long while, she saw something in their eyes that hadn't been there before. Hope. Hope that the oppressive reign of the HOA was finally coming to an end. The real battle had just begun. With the support of her neighbors and the evidence of Karen's corruption, Sarah felt more confident than ever. The next step was clear. Karen needed to be exposed, and Sarah was ready to bring the truth to light. But Karen wasn't done. She wasn't going to let a little setback stop her from trying to control the neighborhood, no matter the cost. Karen's final, desperate move. As Sarah prepared for the showdown she knew was coming, Karen didn't take long to make her next move. This time, however, Karen's actions crossed a line, pushing the conflict to a level Sarah never imagined possible. Late one afternoon, just as Sarah was enjoying a quiet evening with a cup of tea, a loud knock came at her door. When she opened it, she found 2 police officers standing on her porch, their faces grim. "Is everything okay, Ms. Winters?" one officer asked. "Of course," Sarah replied, trying to conceal her growing anxiety. "Why?" "We've been called here to respond to a disturbance," the officer explained. "There's been a complaint about noise and possible damage to property." Sarah's heart sank. She immediately knew who was behind this latest move. Karen had somehow involved the police, claiming that Sarah's disruption over the past few days was disturbing the peace of the neighborhood. It was a blatant attempt to intimidate Sarah into submission. "Karen," Sarah muttered under her breath, but she quickly gathered herself. "There must be some mistake. I haven't caused any disturbance." "We'll need to take a look around," the officer said, his voice flat, though Sarah could see the skepticism in his eyes. "Feel free," Sarah said, standing aside and letting them in. The officers moved cautiously through her home, inspecting the front yard, looking for any sign of the disturbance Karen had reported. But as Sarah expected, they found nothing. No uproar, no damage, just the peaceful beauty of her garden, the roses still standing tall in defiance. After a few minutes, the officers returned to her porch. "We've reviewed everything, and there's no evidence of any wrongdoing on your part. But we will be making a note of this call in case there's any escalation." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She had a strong feeling that Karen's tactics were going to get worse before they got better. And she was right. The following evening, Sarah received yet another letter, but this one was different. It wasn't just a fine or a threat of eviction. This one was a legal summons, claiming Sarah had violated zoning laws with her front yard garden, demanding that she tear everything out or face a lawsuit. The letter came with a warning that her refusal could lead to further legal actions, including the seizure of her property. Sarah's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about roses anymore. Karen had taken the gloves off, trying to break Sarah both financially and emotionally. But Sarah wasn't about to let Karen get away with it. The very next day, Sarah arrived at the HOA meeting prepared. She had printed out copies of every letter Karen had sent, as well as the police report stating there was no disturbance. She had a folder full of evidence, including the documents detailing Karen's illegal financial activities. Money exchanged under the table, contractors getting paid without proper bidding, fines being levied against residents unfairly. When Sarah walked into the HOA meeting room, Karen looked up, clearly startled. She wasn't expecting Sarah to show up prepared to fight. "I'm here to end this," Sarah declared, holding up the folder. "Karen Simmons, you've crossed a line. Your corruption and overreach have gone too far. I've gathered enough evidence to not only prove you're abusing your position, but also to bring charges against you." For a moment, the room was silent. Karen's face drained of color, and she stood frozen, her smug expression evaporating as Sarah continued. "Do you know what happens when you mess with the wrong person?" Sarah asked, her voice unwavering. "You get exposed. And you will be exposed." Karen's face twisted with rage, but there was nothing she could do. Sarah had all the cards now. HOA crumbles and Karen's downfall. The HOA meeting that followed was unlike any Sarah had ever experienced. The air was thick with tension as she presented her case, laying out the evidence piece by piece. She showed the board the financial documents that tied Karen to shady business deals, the fraudulent fines levied against residents, and the illegal ways Karen had abused her position. Each piece of evidence sent shockwaves through the room. Karen, who had once held absolute power over the community, now found herself cornered. Her once confident demeanor faltered as she tried to deflect the accusations, but Sarah's irrefutable proof left her no room to maneuver. The board members who had once blindly followed Karen now exchanged uncertain glances. For the first time, they realized just how deep Karen's corruption ran. "You can't do this," Karen spat, her voice shaky. "I've built this neighborhood into what it is today. You'll regret turning on me." Sarah stood tall, her resolve unshaken. "It's too late for that, Karen. The damage you've done is irreparable. And now it's time to fix this neighborhood, starting with you." The board was silent, but the weight of Sarah's words was clear. One by one, they began to speak up, expressing their concerns over Karen's leadership. Some admitted they had been complicit, while others seemed genuinely shocked by the extent of Karen's corruption. It didn't take long for the momentum to shift in Sarah's favor. Karen, realizing her grip on the board was slipping, tried to make a last-ditch attempt to salvage her position. "I'll step down," she said, her voice laced with desperation. "I'll resign, but this isn't over. You'll regret this. I won't go quietly." But it was too late. The damage was done. The board members, one by one, voted to expel Karen from her position as HOA president. The vote was unanimous. Karen's reign of terror was over. As Sarah left the meeting, she felt a surge of triumph. It was over. Karen was gone, and the HOA that had terrorized her and her neighbors was now in disarray. But Sarah wasn't done yet. She knew that Karen had to face the consequences for her actions. The following week, Karen's world came crashing down. The city's investigation into the HOA's financial dealings began in earnest, and the news spread quickly. Neighbors who had once feared Karen now rallied behind Sarah, offering their support as she pushed for a full investigation into the corruption that had plagued their community. Karen's fall from grace was swift. The city fined the HOA heavily for its mismanagement, and Karen herself found herself the subject of multiple lawsuits. It wasn't long before she was forced to sell her house, her kingdom, and leave the community she had once ruled over with an iron fist. Sarah, on the other hand, was embraced as a hero. She had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, she had not only reclaimed her home, but had restored justice to her neighborhood. The once oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the residents began to rebuild the sense of community that Karen had tried to destroy. As Sarah stood in her front yard, looking over her roses once more, she couldn't help but smile. The fight had been long, but it had been worth it. Her garden, her home, was finally at peace. And as for Karen, she was a footnote in the community's history now, a cautionary tale of what happens when power is abused. The HOA faces full legal consequences. The aftermath of Karen's downfall sent ripples through the community, but it wasn't over yet. As Sarah had anticipated, the city launched a thorough investigation into the HOA's operations. What began as a personal battle over roses quickly turned into a much larger issue. Karen's corrupt practices didn't just affect Sarah. It had impacted every homeowner in the neighborhood. The investigation revealed years of financial mismanagement, illegal fines, and favoritism that had benefited Karen and several other members of the board. It was clear that the HOA, under Karen's leadership, had been running like a corrupt dictatorship, shaking down residents for money and forcing them to conform to ridiculous rules. In the wake of the investigation, the city imposed heavy fines on the HOA. The organization was ordered to pay back the money it had unjustly collected from residents, and many of its policies were declared null and void. What had once been a powerful organization was now a shadow of its former self. Sarah watched the proceedings unfold with satisfaction, knowing that justice was finally being served. As part of the lawsuit she had helped organize, several board members, including Karen, were subpoenaed for their roles in the fraudulent activities. Some of the board members, sensing the legal storm coming their way, decided to settle out of court. But Karen, ever defiant, tried to fight back. However, the mountain of evidence stacked against her made her position untenable. The day the ruling came down, Sarah stood in front of her house, watching as Karen's belongings were loaded onto a moving truck. Karen's once pristine home was now a sign of her downfall. Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. The woman who had caused her so much stress was now facing the consequences of her greed and malice. As Karen's moving truck drove away, Sarah caught a glimpse of the for sale sign in front of her house. The neighborhood had been rid of its tyrant, and the future was finally looking bright again. Karen's personal downfall. Karen Simmons' descent into personal disgrace didn't stop with the dissolution of the HOA and the fines that crippled the organization she once led. Her world unraveled at an alarming pace. Once the queen of her community, she was now a pariah. Her legal troubles continued to mount. The lawsuits filed against her by homeowners she had wronged, including Sarah, took their toll. Karen's assets were frozen, and soon she found herself facing mounting debt she couldn't escape. What little wealth she had accumulated through her corrupt HOA dealings was now gone, drained by legal fees, fines, and restitution payments. The final blow came when Karen attempted to appeal the judgments, hoping to salvage what remained of her reputation. She was last seen at City Hall, arguing vehemently with officials about the fines and her forced resignation. Her desperation was palpable as she tried to manipulate the system one last time. But no one was listening. "Please, I can't lose my home," Karen pleaded with a city clerk, her voice shaking. But it was too late. The people she had once controlled no longer had any sympathy for her. Her manipulative ways had cost her everything. And as her house was auctioned off to cover her debts, she was forced to move into a small apartment in a neighborhood far removed from the one she had once ruled. As for Sarah, she had the satisfaction of knowing that justice had prevailed. It wasn't just about the roses anymore. It was about exposing the truth and ensuring that no one else would suffer the way she had under Karen's rule. Sarah had been the spark that ignited the fire of change, and as she watched Karen's final humiliating defeat unfold, she felt a sense of poetic justice. Karen was now the one dealing with the consequences of her own actions. Epilogue and final mic drop. Months passed, and the neighborhood began to feel like a different place. The oppressive weight of Karen's leadership had lifted, and a sense of unity and peace settled over the community. Residents who had once kept their heads down were now openly talking, socializing, and in many cases, even lending a hand to help each other out. The neighborhood garden was thriving, with flowers blooming in every yard. Sarah's roses had become a symbol of defiance and renewal. One lazy Saturday morning, Sarah was sitting on her front porch, sipping her coffee, when she heard a familiar voice. "Hey, Sarah, got a letter for you," Jessica called from across the street, holding up an envelope. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "From who?" Jessica grinned mischievously and handed it over. "It's from the HOA. With a laugh, Sarah took the letter. She hadn't seen any HOA correspondence since Karen had been removed. When she opened the envelope, she found a letter, but this time, it wasn't a fine or threat. "We regret to inform you that we mistakenly issued a violation for your roses," the letter began. "We now acknowledge their beauty and contribution to the community." Sarah couldn't help but chuckle, rolling her eyes. "They really tried, huh?" Jessica leaned against the porch railing, sipping her coffee. "Guess they figured they'd better not cross you again." "Seems like it," Sarah said with a smile, watching the sun rise over her garden. The whole situation had felt like a roller coaster, but now it was clear that she had won. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had lived in fear of Karen's rule. As Sarah sat back in her chair, looking out over her rose garden, she reflected on how much had changed. The neighborhood, once ruled by fear, was now a place of solidarity and peace. And as for Karen, she was long gone, her fall from grace complete. Sarah raised her cup in a quiet toast to the future. Justice had been served and life was good again. Fade to black.